Some new personal and ancient DNA has come in, so I need to update everything. I've spent a lot of money on personal DNA investigation, and a new paper has come in on DNA in Southeastern Europe that I need to cover. I was surprised by the paper at first. It seemed to undermine everything I've been saying about Southern Anatolians and their place in the steppes of Russia. But when I reviewed the paper a little more closely, and especially after I looked at the supplementary material that came with it, I'm happy to report that my case is just as secure as ever. Also, it's more interesting. It's also closed some important knowledge gaps. But first, let's do a quick survey of some of the things I've already talked about before and preview some of the new stuff that's coming in.
First, let's talk about what I know is not true, and I'm even more firmly convinced it's not true because the DNA now supports the archaeology I've been hammering for more than 2 years. There was no invasion from the steppes of Russia, bringing in the Indo-European language and forcing it on the poor, hapless, mother goddess worshipping farmers. There was no steppe invasion of Iran either. Everything is turning out exactly as I've been saying all along. They were not on our base, we were on theirs, both of us. The DNA is clear. We were in Southeastern Europe, including the western extreme of the Russian steppes, and so my position remains firm. The Indo-European language was first spoken by Anatolians on the steppes of Russia. And since we were in constant contact with our old homeland, that would nicely explain why very old Indo-European languages were spoken in South Central Anatolia, and why these people were surrounded by others who did not speak Indo-European languages, at least as far as we can tell so far. There's zero evidence of any steppe population moving into Anatolia, but there is evidence of an Iranian migration into Anatolia. So, if you've still got a hard-on for steppe invasion, you need to explain why one of these population movements shows up but not the other. Boncuklu Höyük. Less than 10 kilometers from the world-famous Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük, Boncuklu Höyük was settled first and clearly shared the cultural milieu of sites like Çatalhöyük and Çatalhöyük. DNA extracted from residents shows they nicely represent typical Anatolian hunter-gatherers. These samples are more than 10,000 years old. They have a J2a Y-chromosome. So that's why the DNA was showing only one farmer migration, while the archaeology was clearly showing 2 farmer migrations. Both sets of farmers were closely related, but not equivalent. I think there's a discernible gap between the 2 groups, a tiny one. But these people are definitely related to those first farmers. Even their J2a Y chromosome is a good match. Northern India J2a. Virtually all of them are Brahmin, the only Y haplogroup for which that is true. Their closest relatives are in the Balkans. Although J2as are a small minority on the steppes of Russia and among European farmers, they are the only European farmers who made it to India. Nobody is more tightly linked to the Indo-European religion than us J2as, and that will become even more blatant when I am done. It's not even close. And I think we can all agree, if you launch the Indo-European religion, you probably launch the Indo-European language. Now, let's get a close look at those Iranian immigrants. Iranian farmers and Caucasian hunter-gatherers. Both also made it out to the steppes of Russia. Their movement north parallels the Anatolian, but at a slower pace. So I accept the possibility that the Indo-European language is Iranian, and that we have pretty much the same processes involved, a feedback from the steppes back to Anatolia. But not Iran, because Iranian languages are much younger. I insist on the steppes because the vast majority of linguists are certain the language started on the steppes. That's one of the bedrock principles I stick to. Any theory, no matter how crazy, must explain those principles. Another being, there was no steppe invasion of Anatolia, so forget about it. In this case, they would have moved into Anatolia after they started speaking Indo-European. But as you'll see from the DNA, these arrivals are not from the steppes of Russia. They don't have the DNA for it, so that's bad news for the Iranian alternative. But a steppe Iranian origin of the Indo-European language would nicely explain the presence of J2a and European farmers in India, and the stunning absence of J2a. J2a farmers came out of Anatolia exclusively, not Iran.
But right now, I'm still going to say the language is Anatolian. Not out of chauvinism, it's a practical decision. There's still that problem with the Iranian DNA. We built huge settlements in the Balkans and on the steppes of Russia that included buildings 3 if not 4 stories tall. Those are skyscrapers in the Stone Age and the Chalcolithic. We invented metallurgy and were the first people to get out of the Stone Age. I think we invented the wheel. If anybody was going to dazzle their neighbors and convert them to their religion and their language, it would be us. And I'm happy to say that that is exactly how the Indo-European language launched onto the international scene, through culture, and I would say joy, not bloody conquest. That came later, after we realized there were a lot of people in this world who did not know how to behave. I'm going to pencil in the idea of the Iranian origin of the language, though. It's very interesting and I think still promising. But there's a new theory making the rounds in the Celtic scholarship community. Celtic, of course, being another Indo-European language. And I think this theory actually strengthens the Anatolian case.
Celts. We thought they were from the steppes of Russia, but they are originally from northern Spain. It was their refuge during the last ice age. Celtic was probably a trade language brought in from the eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age. The Minoans and their immediate predecessors are the obvious candidates for this, since they had a colony in Sweden. I'd like to point out that the Celts are overwhelmingly R1b Y-chromosome, which is not supposed to have come in until the Aryan invasion. It has also not shown up in Stone Age DNA as of yet. I'm confident that's going to change. Celtic is too old. The Aryan invader model implies they arrived in Western Europe well after 2000 BC, but analysis of word lists indicates Celtic was in Europe before 3000 BC. It might stretch back to 4000 BC. If it's any older than 3000 BC, then I seriously doubt the Indo-European language is steppe Iranian. We're relatively nearby with huge settlements. Celto-Italic. It was once thought that the Celtic and Italic languages were part of a larger family. That theory has been thoroughly refuted by modern linguists. In fact, I always suspect it was wishful thinking. This is very important. I'm so tired of hearing that the Romans are secretly Celts who migrated into Italy from the north. The theoretical connection between these two languages was actually a good foundation to set that case on, although the archaeological case was always terrible. It's not a good foundation anymore. This is Professor Barry Cunliffe. You can find this video on YouTube. This is his map where we know the Celtic language was spoken based on word lists. It's sideways. Spain, Britain, and Ireland are on the bottom. He likes turning maps sideways and upside down. It shakes up your assumptions nicely, doesn't it? It also keeps his students awake. As you can see, this is an Atlantic language, no two ways about it. The line indicates the natural boundary where we would expect to find an authentic, coherent Atlantic European culture. The shading indicates where we know the language was spoken before the Celtic invasion of Italy at the beginning of the 4th century BC. As you can see, they are nicely matched. Lots of navigable rivers in France. They can get around there very easily. These are the books I just got. They're huge and beautiful. I didn't expect that. Well worth the money. The YouTube lecture led me to conclude they started speaking Celtic while we were still in the Balkans. From glancing at the series, it seems the language came later. I'll check it out. The lecture is almost 10 years old, so there have probably been a lot of revelations since. These books each have a series of papers both for and against his shiny new idea. I can't wait to get to work on them.
So now let's get to all that new DNA, starting with my own. It turns out I am not a J2a M92 as I thought. I said that because in all the papers I'd been studying, whenever I looked at the background material, every man who came closest to matching me was an M92, including a very close match in Lebanon. I'm still a sister clade of the M92. I'm Z467. Like the M92, of course, it's a subclade of M67. And this is interesting. It's going to make my case a lot stronger because now I have a different group of men to look at while I'm doing my surveys. Frankly, this wasn't even on my radar before because it didn't show up in any of my papers, or at least they weren't called Z467s. Here's a site where I plugged in all my numbers from Family Tree DNA. nevgen.org. They were actually a little more specific. S25258. That's a subclade of Z467. Here's a map from Family Tree DNA. The Z467 is in green. The Z7671 is yellow. It's a cousin of Z467. SK1336 and SK1337 are daughter clades of Z467. They're daughter clades of S25258. They are red and blue, respectively. I haven't drilled down to those clades yet because that requires more money, and I'm just not in the mood to lay any more out right now, but you get the picture. So we're moving into Southeast Europe, as I said. I now know some of us went as far as the Ukraine. The incoming DNA is telling me this, as well as this map. Some Z467s are there. I'm going to talk about two very critical sites here. The Verteba Cave in the Ukraine, and the Varna Necropolis in Bulgaria, City of the Dead. I'm proud to say I think both of these sites point directly to Christianity. In fact, I was almost going to call this video the 7,000-year-old religion, referring, of course, to Christianity. These two sites also provide solid evidence that these people were the original Indo-Europeans. At the necropolis, we will meet, well, let's call him the first Minoan for now. That's a step too far, but it's not a crazy shot in the dark, you'll see. After a while, we move back down into the Mediterranean, along the west coast of Anatolia, and of course the Cyclades Islands and Crete, where we are known as the Minoans. Then we move from there into colonies in southern Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, and then on to central Italy. Nothing I'm saying in any of these videos is crazy. It's actually the stuff you've been taught about where the Greeks and Romans came from that's crazy. A little more than 200 years after we were expelled from Crete, we launch our famous Sea People invasion. I think this was a reaction to the Greek conquest of the critical city of Troy. We knock out the Mycenaeans, take out our revenge on the Cretans, occupy Cyprus, and then from there send out colonists to the coast of modern Israel. And now we also know northern Syria. About 400 to 500 years later, we're conquered by the Assyrian Empire. Not too long after, that very same empire conquers the kingdom of Israel, and almost manages to conquer the kingdom of Judah, including its capital, Jerusalem. And as part of imperial policy, they took several 100,000 of us and exiled us to Mesopotamia, and exchanged us with several 100,000 other people who'd been conquered in other parts of the empire. This is exactly what we see with the Samaritans in northern Israel. All that shows up nicely. Not too sure about those men in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe, our distribution reminds me a lot of the conquest of Julius Caesar, except for those weird Irishmen. Take a look at where we are in Western Europe. Nice little match. Now, let's go back to the M92s. Those men are all over Eastern Europe. This is a shocking development. In all of my research, nothing like this showed up. It seems to me men with this Y chromosome must have been on the steppes of Russia during the Neolithic. I know of no other time when so many of them would have been on the move in that part of the world. In fact, you see 2 of them right around the Verteba Cave. You don't see any in central Italy, plenty in southern Italy. That's probably some kind of undersampling issue, or maybe they just didn't want to cover up the word Italy. But that absence shows up across all J2a lines on this site. I have no idea what's going on. Same gap here with the M67s. None in central Italy. You also see a couple around the Verteba Cave. Lots of them in Eastern Europe. Again, telling me we must have been there during the Neolithic. Let's be serious. The idea that there are several of these men in the Ukraine and Germany and none in central Italy is ridiculous. There are dark rumors that southern Italians are not 100% European. How else do you explain the southern Italian question of underachievement? Well, there are plenty of Europeans who are underachievers. DNA is not an explanation for this. In fact, the question is actually backwards. The real question is, why are there so many Europeans that are performing so well? Well, let me put it to you like this. You show me a European country that's performing well, and I'll show you a European country that never had to worry about the Muslims, or the Mongols, but especially the Muslims. The French had their scare at the Battle of Tours. The Germans had theirs at the Siege of Vienna. But we were constantly being assaulted by the Muslims. Most of the time we won, but with the Muslims, you only had to lose once. And then for some reason I haven't been able to get to the bottom of, you're screwed, even if you don't convert to Islam. God help you if you do. Here's an exercise. Look up a map of the Byzantine Empire under Justinian the Great. This was a Christian empire that was richer than China. Today, all of the provinces are poor and backwards, including the ones that never converted to Islam. Now, don't go making excuses for the Muslims, because with its dying breath, the Byzantines helped the Italians launch the Renaissance at the Council of Florence. I talk about this in my video, Time for Grown-Ups. And after Constantinople fell, refugees streaming into Italy helped sustain the Renaissance. This is well known. So if Byzantium had remained Christian, they would have been part of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed, and they would have kept up with the rest of Europe. These are all the true peers of southern Italians. This is the standard against which they should really be judged. Now they're not looking so bad anymore, are they? So just as we started our colonies in the south and then ended up in central Italy, under the Roman Empire, Romans poured back out of central Italy into the south and over to the east. And of course, they followed their roads. We have the Via Appia headed to the heel of Italy, the queen of the roads. Then you cross over the Adriatic, pick up the Via Egnatia, and head on over to Constantinople, the second Rome, called today Istanbul, which is a contraction of Constantinople. There's also another road down the west coast. Then you pick up more roads in Sicily. Sicily was occupied by Muslims for more than 250 years, and at one point it was majority Muslim, which means Sicily was one giant pirate ship and slave ship for more than 250 years. You see the toe of Italy pointed right at it? That's called Calabria. It's a little more than 90% mountain and hill. You're out of luck if you're a farmer there, and back in the day, everyone was a farmer. And with Sicily being one giant pirate ship and slave ship,
Calabrians also had to abandon perfectly good land along the shore for generations of a stretch. Obviously, with a geography like Calabria, you need access to the sea, but then there's that giant pirate ship right off the coast. And slave ship. It wasn't much better for the rest of southern Italy. As you can see, this is all one solid block of orange. We're all Romans. We're not perfectly the same, obviously, but you should know that the people living in southern Bulgaria off to the right are even more closely related to the Central Italians than the southern Italians are. That's how blatantly Roman all of these people are. This particular DNA also dominates Sardinia, which had massive Minoan colonies back in the Bronze Age. The Minoans were the masters of bronze, and to make bronze you need copper, which Sardinia has plenty of. We stretch all the way over to cover up most of Tuscany. We're not just Rome, we're Florence too, and Pisa. Our secondary region also includes Bologna, Italy. San Marino is marked. It's an independent enclave within Italy, its own country. They're very wealthy. They're the same people. In one of my papers, I found a man in Siena, Tuscany, whose Y chromosome is very close to mine. That city was founded by a nephew of Romulus himself, who founded Rome. Down south, near Naples, is the city of Benevento. It was settled several times by retired Roman soldiers, and even though it's deep in the south, it remained part of the Papal States in central Italy for centuries.
As for the modern age, it's clear that the reunification of Italy back in the 1860s was bad for southern Italians. It's just a matter of how bad. Maybe not as bad as the Southerners claim, but certainly a lot worse than Northerners are willing to admit. And I now know Southerners didn't want anything to do with this reunification. Back in the 1860s, just like in the United States, Southern Italy was developing a native industrial infrastructure, and they were protecting it behind trade barriers. The United Kingdom of Italy dismantled those barriers. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, as it was called at the time, had a budget surplus, and the United Government confiscated that surplus. They had lower taxes, so now their taxes are going up. And just when they're recovering from their economic blows and they need social welfare programs, the United Government of Italy stole all the land from the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church ran their welfare programs. And to top it all off, it now appears the military commanders were bribed to stand down in the face of northern aggression. I was born in the United States in 1965, and since that time, everything that's happened there has happened here. All of our politicians have been bribed or blackmailed by a hostile alien power, just like the military commanders over there. Our trade barriers have been taken down, and our industrial infrastructure has dried up and blown into the wind. Up to now, I was a little ashamed, not too much, but a little bit, that I was closely related to these people, and I didn't listen to any of their excuses that I thought were bullshit. But I now know that their accusations against the North are 100% realistic. There was a modest gap in favor of the North at the time of reunification, but it wasn't that big, and this was a critical phase in the development of the whole country. Everyone was poor, but the promises of industrialization was great. Southern Italy is the only region that got kicked in the gut during this time. Now, over the next 50 years, about 4 million people would pour out of southern Italy into the world. That's 20% of the population today, 40% of the population then. You'd almost think they lost a war or something. One of those people was my great-great-grandfather, and he was a stonemason out of Naples. That's a skilled trade. His son was a barber. He owned his own barber shop. We're not lazy, and we're not dummies, but we were starving.
A previous study showed that the region of Italy with the highest concentration of men with my J2a Y chromosome is Central Italy, then Sicily, and then Northwest Italy, not the rest of Southern Italy like you think. And when you go back to the farthest known reaches of Italian history, you see that there were confirmed Indo-European speakers in every one of these regions. And look how they're packed in Central Italy. And although they're all typically classified as part of the Italic language family there, they might not be. The evidence is 50-50 that Oscan and Umbrian might be their own separate Indo-European family, which means you not only have a huge variety of Indo-European languages in these regions, you have a variety of language families, or close enough. Nowhere else in the entire history of the Indo-European language will you ever find so many languages packed into such a tiny little space.
The Romans were Anatolians, whose ancestors lived on or near the steppes of Russia sometime before they showed up in Italy. That will be even more blatantly obvious by the time I'm done with this final paper. As far as I'm concerned, if you want to insist they are originally from the steppes of Russia, you need to prove it. And don't forget the Celts, who lived in modern-day France north of the Romans. They might not be from the steppes of Russia either. They might be native to the Atlantic coast, which means somebody converted them to that language. probably when it was a trade language. I'd say the ancestors of these Italians did that. Now, the way these Indo-European languages are packed into central Italy tells us a story. The DNA of the men in central Italy with the J2a Y chromosome tells us the exact same story.
Ancient migratory events in the Middle East. New clues from the Y chromosome variation of modern Iranians. Differently, no sign of J2a M67 expansion is registered in other areas at high variance, such as Iran, Cyprus, Central Italy, hello family tree DNA, and Crete, where the majority of the observed haplotypes are rare and occupy peripheral position in the network. Thus, while the high M67 variance in Central Italy is likely due to a stratification of seaborne migration of Middle Eastern/Asia Minor peoples, the diversification observed in Iran and the Aegean Islands can be explained by first Near Eastern and possibly Anatolian diffusion of the lineage, followed by Levantine expansion. Now later we're going to look at people in a cave in southern Greece. They'd mix with people from the Levant. So the new paper is going to expand the reach of this old one. Stratification of seaborne migrations of Middle Eastern, Asia Minor peoples means several waves of migrations into central Italy. Once again, hello family tree DNA. There's a ridge of mountains going right down the middle of Italy, and it divides all of Italy up into several discrete enclaves. The language, combined with the DNA, strongly indicates that all the people who settled there spoke Indo-European languages. J2a-M92 is a well-defined J2a-M67 sublineage, with the distribution restricted to Asia Minor, the Balkans, and the northeastern Mediterranean coasts. Frequency and variance maps make plausible an origin of northwestern Turkey, where the highest variance is registered, and a subsequent migration to the Balkans and then to the Italian peninsula. That's exactly what I've been talking about. Turkey, Balkans, Italian peninsula. In Iran, it is sporadically observed, with the only exception of Sistan Baluchistan, where it reaches an incidence of 12.5%. According to the age estimate of the microsatellite variation associated to J2a-M92, its presence in Iran is ascribable to recent gene flow. So actually they came through there at most about 1,000 years ago. Now, these J2a-M92s come from the Balkans and northwest Turkey. Again, this is exactly where the Romans say they came from themselves.
And linguists agree the Latin language spent some time in the Balkans before it showed up in Italy. The Latin word for horse, for example, equus, that's not Indo-European. They picked it up in the Balkans. Also, the Italians are not known to be a chariot people, and Roman cavalry is famously half-assed. They got their asses handed to them early and often by the Parthians out of Iran. This confirms that we invented the wheel but not the horse and chariot. By the time it showed up, we were stretched along the Mediterranean in coastal enclaves or in islands, or safely tucked away in Italy. Now, before I get to this final paper, this new paper, I'm going to do a survey of one last paper that I've covered before. This is a doctoral dissertation that I used in my previous video, The Gods Descend, July 24th, 2015. 2 years ago. Man, I've been at this a long time. Molecular genetic investigation of the Neolithic population history in the Western Carpathian Basin. So let's review what I needed to see in this new paper. The Starchevo were the first farmers. These people came out of northwest Anatolia. They are not us. The LBK, or linear band ceramic, is a later extension of the Starchevo. They are also not us, although a J2 has turned up in that culture. We don't know if he was an A or a B. This is where I say we came in, the Vinča. The archaeology certainly indicates these are not the same people. We suddenly see huge settlements, and the final Neolithic starts with them. We thought they invented metallurgy, but it turns out they were already metallurgists when they showed up. Thus, they and their relatives back in wherever they came from were the first to get out of the Stone Age. Notice they stayed in contact with the Mediterranean, unlike the Starchevo, the Sopot, and the Lingual. With the Lysingia complex, everything suddenly stops. No more big settlements, and they apparently even go back into the Stone Age. Now, we're going to add another culture that's not covered in the doctoral dissertation, the Cucuteni, also called the Trypillian. It was called the Cucuteni by the Romanians, Trypillian by the Ukrainians, and only later did archaeologists realize they were looking at the same culture. The dissertation was about Hungary, so naturally they didn't cover these people. Cucuteni started moving into the region about 4800 BC, and it ended sometime after 3500 BC.
The culture is thought to continue until 3000 BC, but many argue it's actually a different group of people. I think it was too. So there's an excellent chance they are the eastern successors to the Vinča. The timing is certainly on point.
As I said, the Vinča acted different from the farmers who came before them. They built huge settlements and they started making the world-famous figurines. But there's something else you can tell that's different about the Vinča from looking at their mitochondrial DNA. You get that from your mother. From that, we can tell that they picked their wives from a much greater variety of geographic regions. Most importantly, that included the steppes of Russia.
This is where the first farmers got their wives from. This is the Starchevo. There's this odd little spot that you'll see in all the maps. I suspect these women are ultimately from the Middle East as well. Now, the linear band Karamic, which succeeded the Starchevo. We don't have anything from the Vinča, but here's the Sopot. Boom. See how lit up the map is now? Now let's step back to remind ourselves. Then the Sopot. Then move on to the Lingual, still lit up very nicely. Then the Lasinja. And just as the large settlements disappear in the Balkans, so do the large-scale connections with the steppes of Russia. So this tells us that somebody moved into Southeastern Europe, stayed there about 17 centuries, and then left. I say that's my ancestors, and I call that our Balkan interlude. Which brings us to our new paper, The Genomic History of Southeastern Europe.
At first, I thought this paper was a setback. As I've just shown you, I've argued for quite a while that there were two migrations of farmers into Southeastern Europe. The first from northwest Anatolia, the second from South Central Anatolia. The conclusion drawn by the authors contradicts that, but there's a big gap in their sample data. I'll show you. So this conclusion rests on a foundation of sand.
We show that the people who brought farming to Europe were not part of a single population, as early farmers in southern Greece are not descendant from the Neolithic population of northwestern Anatolia that was ancestral to all other European farmers. Well, as a matter of fact, we're going to take a close look at those farmers in southern Greece. We already talked about them. The Levantine expansion, we were looking at the Y chromosome. Let's start with the graph that they made out of all the samples. It's going to really help focus our attention. These are all the Anatolian Neolithic samples, purple circles with the light purple centers. The Boncuklu are the purple squares with the black centers. Although they say these Neolithic Anatolians and early farmers are pretty much the same people, I detect a noticeable population split here. That one Boncuklu on the far right is very different from the others. He's right by those orange squares to the right. He's definitely drawn to the Peloponnese Neolithic samples they talk about in the introduction. They're from southern Greece, and he fits comfortably in with the Greek Neolithic samples. One of his parents, at least, was not from Boncuklu. He himself might not have been. Now, the Peloponnese folks had probably mixed in with the people from the Levant. There we go. That's modern-day Syria and Israel, almost certainly by trade. This is the Balkans Neolithic. These are the actual farmers, red triangles with green centers. You see one clustering way on the far right next to those Greeks in that odd Boncuklu sample. As time moves on, these farmers either mixing with natives of Europe, as you see with the Langil sample, or people from the steppes of Russia, as we see with the Balkans Chalcolithic, red diamonds with blue center, the Varna, and the later Balkans Bronze Age. Remember the perfectly preserved body of Oetzi, the Iceman they found in northern Italy? He's Remedello Bronze Age. This graphic helps explain who those southern Greeks are. First, let's look up here with the red. That's the Eastern hunter-gatherers. This is a very old steppe population. Then the Yamnaya. They're the glamorous steppe invaders that everybody insists are the original Indo-Europeans. Remember that, red and orange. Now let's zoom into this graph. And we see our Greeks, once again, the Peloponnese Neolithic, 4100 to 4000 BC. And you see they've got Eastern hunter-gatherer and Yamnaya DNA, centuries before these people are supposed to have shown up in Greece. Their remains were found in the Verteba Cave. As you can see, it's not far at all from where the Vinča had access to the Aegean Sea. It's no mystery who these women are, actually, and almost all these samples are from women. They came from the north and mixed with people from the east. And just as we were carrying their DNA south, they were also carrying our DNA east. Two Yamnaya individuals, one from Ozera in Ukraine and one from Bulgaria, in addition, have evidence of early European farmer-related admixture, which is the first evidence of such ancestry in Yamnaya individuals. Similarly, one Copper Age individual, dated to around 3600 to 3400 BC, about 500 years after our Greeks, from Derevka in Ukraine, has both Caucasian hunter-gatherer and farmer ancestry. This is by far the earliest appearance of farmer ancestry this far east in Eurasia, which is previously not known on the steppe until the Shrubnaya complex around 1800 BC, 18 centuries later. These are the 4 Boncuklu samples and their supplementary material. For the men, their Y chromosomes are on the far right, G2A, 2B, 2B. The numbers on the far right are age ranges for each sample. There might be 2 age ranges given, one based on the archaeology and the other based on radiocarbon dating. The number on the far left is age before present. It's the midpoint of the ranges given. And since their present is 1950, which I think is crazy because it should be 2000, I added the column in red in the center. This is the date BC. So we're looking at the latter part of the 9th millennia BC, about 3 centuries after 8300 BC. Douglas Baird has excavated the site. One of his lectures is on YouTube, Houses and Skulls, Households and Corporate Groups at Neolithic Boncuklu. It's in South Central Anatolia. It's less than 10 kilometers from Çatalhöyük, about 6 miles, 31 kilometers from another important Neolithic site at Pınar, about 20 miles. Typical grain complements for different sites. Pınar is very primitive. Boncuklu is learning how to farm from people living in the southeast. Right beneath them is a Çatalhöyük. They were around at the same time, and I think they were the true predecessors for the people at Çatalhöyük. The people at both sites lived in much larger communities than you see at Boncuklu. Their buildings tended to be larger, and they were much more durable. Their farming practices were also much more extensive than what you see at Boncuklu. They not only had more choices, they had more of each choice. So all the behavior differences that we see more than 2,000 years later in Southeastern Europe are already showing up here in South Central Anatolia in the Pre Pottery Neolithic.
And here's one more behavior difference for you, and parallel. The people at Çatalhöyük and Çatalhöyük were mining copper. We know that because we found copper beads at their sites. Remember me talking about the Vinča and how wherever they came from, their people were already metallurgists? Looks like we have a winner. And this falls in line with previous archaeology, which showed that metallurgy started in Southeastern Europe and South Central Anatolia at the same time.
Now let's look at the sample gaps in this paper. People I desperately needed to see to either prove or disprove my case are not in this report. On that left column, which is in alphabetical order, you see in the selected rows that there are no Vinča samples. Although when I looked through the Bronze Age Neolithic samples, I saw they had 3 from Gomulova in Serbia. That's a major Vinča site. It was strange they didn't call them Vinča. This was originally an LBK site and wasn't settled by the Vinča until around 5000 BC. So the first guy is too early. They were definitely gone by 4600 BC. They're probably gone by 4650, so the last 2 are almost certainly too late. Only 2 Sopot samples. Remember, this culture lasted 1,400 years. These samples don't even scratch the surface. They come from about 4650 and 4674 BC. The Sopot are in their prime at this time. Great news. But the samples themselves aren't helpful for resolving my mystery. The man has an Y chromosome, so he's probably the descendant of local hunter-gatherers. And we have a single lingual sample, a male from about 4424 BC, so this is near the end of the lingual culture. We saw him on the gene graph. He's an I2A1, so he certainly has a local hunter-gatherer background. Look at all these LBK samples, 21 of them, and 3 Starchevo samples, 2 male, neither of which has a G2a Y chromosome. That's a hallmark of the first European farmers. You can rarely swing a bat in these samples without hitting a man with a G2a Y chromosome, but this is one of the times you could. The Anatolian Neolithic samples are lopsided. They heavily favor northwest Anatolia, where we know we'll find those first farmers. There are 5 samples from Vinča in the southwest Anatolia. That was an unexpected surprise. 3 men, 2 G2A and 1 I Y chromosome. One of only 2 in Anatolia in this study. The other was northwest Anatolia. So they probably drifted there out of Europe. In this whole paper, full of Anatolians and even a few Iranians, we have a grand total of 3 confirmed J2As. The top in northwest Turkey, right at the beginning of the farmer migration out of Europe, into Europe. The oldest in the middle is a Caucasian hunter-gatherer whose descendants moved into the steppes of Russia after the last ice age. and the third one was in the Balkans and was probably alive during the Trojan War. There's a J2 right above them who's LBK. As I said earlier, he's not typed any farther. And right below them is the only J2b man. He lived farther north in Croatia about 400 years before. Here are those promising Greeks. Out of 8 total samples, we have 1 male. Ridiculous.
Now, as I said in the introduction, there was a migration wave from Iran into Anatolia that previous archaeology did not pick up on. I was relieved to see that because I was detecting echoes of Zoroastrianism on Minoan Crete, and as far as their contemporaries in Iran were concerned, they might as well have been living in China. But I wasn't completely bereft of comfort. You need to add tin to copper to make true bronze, and archaeologists thought the Minoans were getting their tin from Afghanistan, so these Iranians were probably working on trade routes. Let's see how they fit in.
We're going to stick with these Greek farmers. They're not quite the outlier the authors of this paper think they are. Here's Kumtepe, purple diamond with a powder blue center. The settlement is right near the city of Troy. In fact, it's the first settlement in the whole region. They were around about 4700 to 4600 BC, just when the Vinča culture was starting to unravel. This is 500 years before those Greek farmers, and as you can see, this woman from northwest Turkey is almost an exact match for one of them. Both the Kumtepe samples are women, so once again I'm denied access to a decent male chromosome. This is getting silly. This is a Tepekik Chiflik, purple triangle, peach center. One of them would fit in almost seamlessly with our Greeks. These are by far the oldest of the 3 samples we're zeroing in on here now, about 6500 BC in South Central Anatolia, 200 to 300 years before the first farmers show up in Europe. 2 males sampled. They were G2A and C1A in their Y chromosomes. And they in turn are just reaching out to the Anatolian Bronze Age people, who are descendants of those Iranian immigrants. We have 3 samples, only 1 male. He's a J1A. They range from about 2650 to 2150 BC. About 2150 or 2200 actually, there was some kind of ecological collapse that drove us out of the Aegean and onto mainland Crete in large numbers. It also hit China and India and even North America. Here's where those Iranian descendants were found, the Isparta province. This is Tepekik Chiflik, where the oldest samples are from, and this is Kumtepe, somewhere around there.
So despite the gaps, the DNA is showing migrations into Anatolia. But you know what it's not showing? The Aryan invasion from the steppes of Russia we've been hearing about for 100 years.
One version of the steppe hypothesis of Indo-European language origins suggests that Proto-Indo-European languages developed in the steppe north of the Black and Caspian Seas, and that the earliest known diverging branch, Anatolian, was spread into Asia Minor by movements of steppe peoples through the Balkan Peninsula during the Copper Age around 4000 BC, as part of the same incursions from the steppe that coincided with the decline of the Tel settlements. If this were correct, then one way to detect evidence of it would be the appearance of large amounts of characteristic steppe ancestry, first in the Balkan Peninsula and then in Anatolia. However, our genetic data do not support this scenario. While we find steppe ancestry in Balkan Copper Age and Bronze Age individuals, this ancestry is sporadic across individuals in the Copper Age and at low levels in the Bronze Age. Moreover, while Bronze Age Anatolian individuals have Caucasian hunter-gatherer and Iran Neolithic-related ancestry, they have neither the Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry characteristic of all steppe populations sampled to date, nor the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry that is ubiquitous in Southeastern Europe in the Neolithic. So if they came from the steppes and passed through the Balkans, we'd see people from the steppes in the Balkans, and we don't see that. This pattern is consistent with that seen in northwestern Anatolia and later in Copper Age Anatolia, suggesting continuing migration into Anatolia from the east rather than from Europe. Again, the Iranians are showing up, but not them. And although the Iranians also moved out into the steppes, these Iranians are not from the steppes. So the DNA is now lining up perfectly with the archaeology I've been hammering for more than 2 years now. The resemblances between Çatalhöyük and trans-Caucasian sites and horizons, such as Maykop, Bedeni, Martkopi, and Trialeti, is often restricted to single objects rather than complete assemblages, and in many cases the assemblages compared are not from the same time period. For example, the tomb inventory at Maykop, which has often been compared to that of Alaka, contains only one object that bears a superficial resemblance to one object from Alaka in a much larger assemblage of goods. Furthermore, Maykop is now dated to about 3700 to 3400 BC, more than 1,000 years earlier than Çatalhöyük. So, There are no meaningful parallels between what we see in North Central Anatolia, which is where Çatalhöyük is, and what we see on the steppes of Russia. Now, it's interesting that the steppe invasion fans made such a big deal about the alleged connections between these people and the people on the steppes, because these people did not speak Indo-European languages. They spoke Hatti. Nobody knows what that language was. The Indo-European speakers lived south of Alaka. They wouldn't conquer that territory for another 800 years. Summarizing the evidence for the early Bronze Age 3 discussed in this section, the following issues have become clear. First, the hiatus between early Bronze Age 2 and 3 that one often encounters in the literature and that has been linked with the migration wave and the coming of Indo-Europeans can be discounted. There's both continuity of occupation and continuity of cultural traditions across this chronological boundary. So, once upon a time, there was a big settlement gap. On one side of the gap, people lived one way. On the other, they lived a completely different way. That would justifiably imply an invasion. But now, we know the gap in settlement just came from a gap in archaeology. That gap has now been closed. Due to various factors, but mostly relating to archaeological research and publication practices, we are relatively uninformed about the nature of settlements in Western Asia Minor. However, there is some evidence that this was not a period of regression in the West, as was postulated in the past. There might be a gap in Western Asia Minor, but probably not. But that's not going to do you any good anyway, because the Indo-European speakers, once again, lived in South Central Anatolia. And speaking of South Central Anatolia, by contrast, Central Anatolia comes into sharper relief during the early Bronze Age 3, mainly due to spectacular inventories of the Çatalhöyük burials, which I already talked about. These burials were probably created by relatively simple societies without states and cities. It is in South Central Anatolia that the early Bronze Age 3 period probably saw the rise of large urban settlements and possibly regional polities, the precursors of those that are well known from text and archaeology in the early 2nd millennium BC. Now, it's in South Central Anatolia that we find the biggest and earliest settlements. These people spoke Indo-European languages. The obvious conclusion is they're descendants of the people who lived in giant ancient sites like Çatalhöyük and Çatalhöyük, because what we see there is a natural progression from that previous culture. And they act nothing like their neighbors and absolutely 100% nothing like the steppe people who are supposed to have conquered them. But they act a lot like those second group of farmers I keep talking about.
The Aryan invasion theory has been fatally wounded for years now. This new DNA evidence just kicks the poor thing when it's down. But it's only getting worse from here. I'm not even halfway finished yet.
An alternative hypothesis is that the ultimate homeland of Proto-Indo-European languages was in the Caucasus or in Iran. In this scenario, westward movement contributed to the dispersal of Anatolian languages, and northward movement, in mixture with Eastern hunter-gatherer, was responsible for the formation of the population associated with the Yamnaya complex. These steppe pastoralists plausibly spoke a late Proto-Indo-European language that is ancestral to many of the non-Anatolian branches of the Indo-European language family. On the other hand, our data would still be consistent with the steppe Balkans Anatolia route hypothesis model, albeit with constraints. It remains possible that populations dating to around 1600 BC in the region where the Indo-European Luvian, Hittite, and Pellaean languages were spoken did have European hunter-gatherer ancestry. However, our results would require that such ancestry was not ubiquitous in Bronze Age Anatolia and was perhaps tightly linked to Indo-European speaking groups. We predict that additional insight about the genetic origins of the potential speakers of early Indo-European languages will be obtained when ancient DNA becomes available from additional sites in this key period in Anatolia and the Caucasus.
The steppe origin of the Indo-European language is bedrock. Most linguists agree the language itself betrays that. It did not start in Iran or the Caucasus Mountains. And the earliest Indo-European language by far is Anatolian. Some of the things that we thought were weird and specific to Anatolian turned out to be Proto-Indo-European, like their heavy use of particles. Yet, Aryan invaders did not swoop into Anatolia without having an impact on the archaeology and leaving behind any DNA. That's crazy. Finally, we are on the steppes of Russia. We're where we need to be when we need to be there. The Aryan invasion theory is 100% unnecessary. In fact, it's worse than unnecessary. It actively poisons the intellectual environment. It's embedded so deep into people's heads that they can't properly evaluate all this new data, even though all of it points to the exact same conclusion. Now, I'm about to switch gears. I am mostly done with my DNA case. Although I'm pretty disappointed in this paper, it has directed my attention to a couple of very interesting sites. Both of them are on the steppes of Russia, and both are full of Anatolians. The Verteba Cave in the Ukraine, which I'm going to deal with first, and the Varna Necropolis in Bulgaria. I'm going to call what follows Tales from the Steppes. Now, both of these sites are very gratifying to me as an Anatolian and as a Christian. A lot of the most interesting things about my religion start way up here, and not just in the New Testament, the Old Testament too. Things I'm about to show you have had a spectacular impact on the whole Bible. But first, I'm going to give you a down payment. Pack it away and put it in the bank, because it's going to come back around near the end of this video, bearing interest. Okay, so I say these the Minoans came down from the Balkans, and they're already speaking an Indo-European language. So we should expect to see them acting like Balkan folks. We do. There are now good indications that the practice of intentional burning of abandoned buildings after a life cycle of their use was widespread in the late Neolithic of the northern Balkans. Even more surprising is that abandoned buildings were burned with their complete inventories of pottery and other artifacts left behind. This practice contributed to the preservation and great visibility of buildings and associated material culture. It seems that the act of building destruction was far from a profane activity. Through the act of intentional burning, the whole sequence of life events associated with a particular building and materialities of daily life with specific memories attached to them was somehow sealed beneath the rubble of burned mud walls. It is also important to emphasize that the intentional house burning, which, if to be successful in turning wall mud into a hard daub rubble, must have lasted for several days, was more than the decision of an autonomous household, as the act of burning of a single building in a closely spaced village must have been of major concern for all neighboring buildings. So this was a big deal. It required careful, collective attention. They probably had their own Chalcolithic version of a fire marshal. Most likely it was the priest. And in the Ukraine, they carried on with this, but they weren't just satisfied with an individual house. They would intermittently burn down entire villages. Now, let's move to the Minoan parallel. Life and death of a Bronze Age house. Excavation of early Minoan 1 levels at Priniatikos Pyrgos. The early Minoan 1 period, 3100 to 2650 BC, marks the beginning of the Bronze Age on Crete. In 2010, a portion of a well-preserved domestic building dating to the later part of early Minoan 1 was excavated at Priniatikos Pyrgos, eastern Crete. Though only a small portion of this house was available to investigate, there is clear evidence for several architectural and habitation phases. The final domestic activities were particularly well preserved because the building was deliberately destroyed in an event that included burning. There was a distinct and clearly defined ritual component to this event, including the decommissioning of household objects. Because of the rapid abandonment and destruction of this building, the excavated area contained well-preserved evidence for the character of use of the building in its final days. This is the exact same behavior, because these are the exact same people. Now I'm going to talk about these people, the Trypillian. I was surprised they had Trypillian samples because the Trypillian didn't leave any bodies behind. I think they were the predecessors of the Zoroastrians, who often lead their dead out to be scavenged by the wild animals. So once again, you have my attention. You're not behaving like everybody else, which tells me you're not the same as everybody else. Now, it would be different if a bunch of Trypillian hikers fell down into a hole in the middle of the night. That would be a random sample. But these are not random Trypillian hikers. These people were put into this cave on purpose. The Verteba Cave, a subterranean sanctuary of the Kukutini Trypillia culture in western Ukraine. Here's a photo of the team in the entrance. And here's a photo I found on the internet. So now I'm going to do something really fun. I'm going to treat this cave and the contents of this cave as if somebody brought it to me in a dream. Because in matters of the unconscious, it might as well all be a dream. It might be unconscious projection onto a cave and the bodies in the cave as we see here, or it could be a dream proper. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So I'm going to work through this. You could say interpret, but dreams are full of quantum symbols that you can spend decades working through. I'm sure I can do the same here with this Chalcolithic collective dream, but I can already go a long way with it. and I'm going to use Carl Jung's technique for working through dreams, or at least the technique as I understand it. I like that technique a lot, and for two major reasons. First, I always feel such relief after I've worked through a dream. I know I got it. And secondly, and this is most important and most interesting, every time I work through a dream, it never means anything like I thought it did. The first glance is never right. It's always 100% wrong. That's because these dreams aren't coming from you, as you know you. They're coming from deep you, big you. And let me let you in on a little secret. You're a big deal. You're made in God's image. That's why demons fight so hard to keep you. It's just a matter of figuring out how you work. Now, when I saw this cave and the contents of this cave, I knew instantly I was going to treat it like it was a dream, because somebody had this dream. Carl Jung did.
As I've already said, Freud was able to interpret the dreams I was then having only incompletely, or not at all. These were dreams with collective contents, containing a great deal of symbolic material. One in particular was important to me, for it led me for the first time to the concept of the collective unconscious, and thus formed a kind of prelude to my book, Von Lügen und Simpel der Libido. Something to keep in mind that Carl Jung discovered. You have a personal unconscious, obviously. But that personal unconscious sits on top of an inherited collective unconscious, just like your personal physical body sits on top of an inherited body plan. Jung's dream, as you will see, comes from the collective inherited unconscious. Freud never came to this obvious conclusion, did not account for the existence of a collective unconscious, and was therefore hopeless when it came to interpreting this dream. Jung's von Lügen would force a split between Jung and Freud. This was the dream. I was in a house I did not know, which had 2 stories. It was my house. I found myself in the upper story, where there was a kind of salon furnished with fine old pieces in Rococo style. On the walls hung a number of precious old paintings. I wondered that this should be my house and thought, not bad. But then it occurred to me that I did not know what the lower floor looked like. Descending the stairs, I reached the ground floor. This is his conscious orientation. Then he moves into the personal unconscious. There, everything was much older, and I realized that this part of the house must date from about the 15th or 16th century. The furnishings were medieval. The floors were of red brick. Everywhere it was rather dark. I went from one room to another thinking, now I really must explore the whole house. I came upon a heavy door and opened it. Beyond it, I discovered a stone stairway that led down to the cellar. Now, he's starting to descend into a more collective level. Descending again, I found myself in a beautifully vaulted room which looked exceedingly ancient. Examining the walls, I discovered layers of brick among the ordinary stone blocks, and chips of brick in the mortar. As soon as I saw this, I knew that the walls dated from Roman times. My interest by now was intense. I looked more closely at the floor. It was of stone slabs, and in one of these I discovered a ring. When I pulled it, the stone slab lifted, and once again I saw a stairway of narrow stone steps leading down into the depths. Jung talks often about the movement of the unconscious. He described it as an enantiodromia, a movement back and forth, or a circumambulation, a movement around a center. This movement shows up here in the dream with the ring and in the Verteba Cave. As a matter of fact, look at what these stone slabs are covering. These too I descended and entered a low cave cut into the rock. Thick dust lay on the floor, and in the dust were scattered bones and broken pottery, like the remains of a primitive culture. I discovered 2 human skulls, obviously very old and half disintegrated. Then I awoke.
Every once in a while, Carl Jung talks about cryptamnesia. Crypto meaning hidden, amnesia meaning amnesia. You read something and then you forgot that you read it, and then you come up with stuff that from what you read and as if it's original idea because you forgot you read it. This cave and some of its skulls and some of its pottery was found about 50 years before Carl Jung had this dream. And it's possible that he read about it and remembered that he read about it, but I think he would have said something about that. So either he never read about it, or he read about it and he forgot that he read about it. Cryptamnesia. But even if he read about it and remembered he read about it, that still doesn't mean this dream is not important. Say you're on Mulberry Street that day, and that night you have a dream about Mulberry Street. And so you think, well, I was on Mulberry Street. Well, you were probably on several streets that day. Why are you dreaming about Mulberry Street? Why dream about being on a street at all? Now, for the quote that follows, It's not necessarily apropos to our case, but the split between Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung is a big deal. A lot of people talk about it. Some people accuse Carl Jung of being anti-Semitic. But the reality is, Carl Jung was smarter than Sigmund Freud. He was a better psychiatrist, and that drove Freud crazy. He really hated that. And although Carl Jung would never say this, Sigmund Freud was a liar. And his fundamental dishonesty is on full display here in this quote. Now keep in mind as I read it, both men had agreed to tell each other their dreams. And when it came Freud's turn to tell his dream, he reneged on the deal.
What chiefly interested Freud in this dream were the two skulls. He returned them repeatedly and urged me to find a wish in connection with them. What did I think about these skulls, and whose were they? I knew perfectly well, of course, what he was driving at, that secret death wishes were concealed in the dream. But what does he really expect of me, I thought of myself. Toward whom would I have death wishes? I felt violent resistance to such interpretation. Okay, this violent resistance is important. Your unconscious will let you know when you've missed the mark. I also had some intimation of what the dream might really mean, but I did not then trust my own judgment and wanted to hear Freud's opinion. I wanted to learn from him. Therefore, I submitted to his intention and said, my wife and my sister-in-law. After all, I had to name someone whose death was worth wishing. I was newly married at the time and knew perfectly well that there was nothing within myself which pointed to such wishes, but I would not have been able to present to Freud my own ideas on an interpretation of the dream without encountering incomprehension and vehement resistance. I did not feel up to quarreling with him, and I also feared that I might lose his friendship if I insisted on my own point of view. On the other hand, I wanted to know what he would make of my answer, and what his reaction would be if I deceived him by saying something that suited his theories, and so I told him a lie. I was quite aware that my conduct was not above reproach, but à la guerre comme à la guerre. It would have been impossible for me to afford him any insight into my mental world. The gulf between it and his was too great. In fact, Freud seemed completely helpless in dealing with certain kinds of dreams and had to take refuge in his doctrine. I realized that it was up to me to find out the real meaning of the dream. Now, Jung walks us through the interpretation of the dream. It was plain to me that the house represented a kind of image of the psyche, that is to say, of my then state of consciousness, with hitherto unconscious additions. Consciousness was represented by the salon, and had an inhabited atmosphere, in spite of its antiquated style. The ground floor stood for the first level of the unconscious. The deeper I went, the more alien and the darker the scene became. In the cave, I discovered remains of a primitive culture, that is, the world of the primitive man within myself, a world which can scarcely be reached or illuminated by consciousness. The primitive psyche of man borders on the life of the animal soul, just as the caves of prehistoric time were usually inhabited by animals before man had laid claim to them. There are human skulls in the Verteba Cave. There are also animal skulls.
Now, when you're dealing with somebody's dreams, including your own, the conscious orientation of the dreamer is very important. Sometimes the unconscious will act in what Carl Jung called a compensatory function. It acts like a seesaw or a teeter-totter. Balances you out when you're a little too high or too low. Like, for example, once Carl Jung had a patient who was a successful businessman, and he saw his anima, his soul, as a poor servant girl. He was flying too high. Once I saw my anima as a movie star literally flying high in a jet airplane. I was buried in a crater. But sometimes the conscious ego is really focused on a critical question, spending night and day thinking about it. And at that point, the unconscious might step up with some very critical inspiration. That's what happened with this dream.
During this period, I became aware of how keenly I felt the difference between Freud's intellectual attitude and mine. I had grown up in the intensely historical atmosphere of Basel at the end of the 19th century, and had acquired, thanks to reading the old philosophers, some knowledge of the history of psychology. When I thought about dreams and the contents of the unconscious, I never did so without making historical comparisons. In my student days, I always used Krug's old dictionary of philosophy. I was especially familiar with the writers of the 18th and early 19th century. Okay, that's what's known as amplification. You also use association. You know about association. What do you think when you think about such and such a part of your dream? But since our personal unconscious is based on an impersonal unconscious foundation, you use dream dictionaries and symbol dictionaries, or in his case, a philosophy dictionary. This will give you a broader view of the images you're working through. I'm going to do both when I work through the imagery of the Verteba Cave. Theirs was the world which had formed the atmosphere of my first century salon. By contrast, I had the impression that Freud's intellectual history began with Buchner, Moschott, Du Bois-Reymond, and Darwin. The dream pointed out that there were further reaches to the state of consciousness I had just described: the long, uninhabited ground floor medieval style, then the Roman cellar, and finally the prehistoric cave. These signified past times and past stage of consciousness. So here's what he's thinking. This is what the dream was responding to. Certain questions had been much on my mind during the days preceding this dream. They were: on what premises is Freudian psychology founded? To what category of human thought does it belong? What is the relationship of its almost exclusive personalism to general historical assumption? This exclusive personalism is exactly what's wrong with Freudian theory and practice. My dream was giving me the answer. It obviously pointed to the foundation of cultural history, a history of successive layers of consciousness. My dream thus constituted a kind of structural diagram of the human psyche. It postulated something in altogether impersonal nature underlying the psyche. It clicked, as the English have it. Clicked. That's the opposite of a violent resistance. There's a push and a pull. The unconscious will do what it needs to get its point across, if you listen to it. And the dream became for me a guiding image which in the days to come was to be corroborated to an extent I could not at first suspect. It was my first inkling of a collective a priori beneath the personal psyche. This I first took to be traces of earlier modes of functioning. Later, with increasing experience and on the basis of more reliable knowledge, I recognized them as forms of instinct, that is, as archetypes. Now we're all set up. Let's go back to the cave. The cave itself has a floor area of 23,000 square meters and a capacity of 47,000 cubic meters, with a combined length of all the passageways inside the cave totaling 8 kilometers. So we have a cave with a labyrinth of tunnels that should instantly remind you of the Minoans on Crete. It should be highlighted that there are several larger karst caves in the Bilt-Zlot region. However, traces of human occupation were only found in Verteba Cave. Regardless of this finding, the cave did not provide proper conditions for permanent inhabitancy per se. An obvious lack of an independent water source, poor ventilation, permanent darkness, and very difficult or near inaccessible entrances, steep funnel-like precipice, can be mentioned among few leading reasons. The fact that this cave has very difficult or near inaccessible entrances is a feature, not a flaw. It's not good for permanent residency, but it's perfect for what the cave is actually going to be used for. I'm going to show you echoes of what went on in this cave thousands of years down the line, even beyond the labyrinth of Minoan Crete. Nonetheless, the specific appearance of artifacts and a significant volume of selected human remains undoubtedly indicates the cultic function of this site. Data collected in this study evidently points towards a multi-directional exchange network amongst a few local populations. The simultaneous presence of imported goods and local wares suggests the significant trans-regional importance of the Verteba sanctuary in a long-distance network of connections. The same can be maintained about the immaterial aspects of the Trypillian cult. So this wasn't a local thing, this was regional. People hundreds of miles away knew how important this cave was.
Now, when I heard they had Trypillian bodies, I was intrigued. Then I was disappointed when I saw the DNA results. These are not the people my model predicted. But now I'm confident these are not Trypillian. So who are they? Well, the very same paper that brought them to our attention has supplied us with an answer. But before I read what follows, think about the demographics of this group. The large majority of them are men in their prime. Some kids, some women, some old people, but mostly men in their prime. Nasal septum deviation, probably caused by impact trauma, was found in the cranium belonging to an adult male about 40 years of age, Verteba sample number 19. This male had sustained a fracture to the inferior end of the nasal bone, slightly flattening and splaying both halves. The changes suggest a blow on the nose from directly in front of the individual, possibly accidental but more likely deliberate, using a blunt implement. Moreover, the same individual sustained severe perimortem blunt force injury to the right eye, quite likely resulting from multiple blows. It is shown as a comminuted fracture to the left supraorbital margin with fracture lines. Perimortem is at or near the time of death with no evidence of healing. Female skull number 16 showed several distinctive marks of traumatic brain injury. The occipital bone was crushed from behind by a large object, which left a circular depressed fracture to the parietal, probably in combination with a frontal fracture measuring around 9 to 10 millimeters. She died due to a severe brain-penetrating wound caused by a high-velocity blow with a long and pointy implement from the back. In addition, 2 deep
antemortem longitudinal grooves have been recorded on the parietal bone, presumably the marks of a stone hammer. Her nasal septum had been totally removed, probably post-mortem. Specific patterning of craniocerebral damage has been recognized in 3 male crania recently uncovered in Verteba Cave, figure 16, which we're about to look at. In all 3 cases, we are dealing with a large subcircular comminuted depressed fracture which penetrates the skull. The ectocranial margins are sharp. The majority of tropylian materials in the Verteba Cave indicate the presence of a highly developed eschatological vision of the afterlife and rites of passage. Mortuary rituals seem to combine animalistic beliefs and apotropaic magic, that's warding off magic. Nonetheless, certain evidence shows implements typical for warfare assemblages, trophy taking, or executions. Okay? According to some authors, the overall context of Verteba skeletal assemblages can simply be seen as evidence of trophy taking and cranial surgery and interpersonal violence. In fact, in this paper, we demonstrate that the complexity of tropylian rituals goes way beyond that. But nevertheless, the layout implies that these people are not tropylian. These are the 3 male skulls, figure 16. Take a good look at those wounds, especially the one on the left, far left. Now compare it to this death blow from the Battle of Towton in 1461. This battle was fought in the middle of a snowstorm. It might have been the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The club on the right is a Bronze Age wooden club from Germany. Now, let's look at what body parts are stored here. That will be important. Skeletal remains from Verteba Cave can be divided into a few categories. Both human and animal remains exhibit similar levels of contextual complexity. The vast majority of human bone is represented solely by crania and mandibles, excluding 2 cases, a child and an unidentified adult, stored in Krakow. No other bodily parts were ever found. The deposition of crania, with or without mandibles, must be analyzed separately, as it may exhibit diversity with respect to the cultural phenomenon. Today, all materials deriving from Verteba Cave are divided between museums in Krakow and Borschiv in more or less equal proportions, with the only difference being all child remains are stored in Poland.
Pay attention, this part is important. First, we're going to talk about a weird thing that was going on in the Neolithic Balkans. Then we're going to put this together with the fact that virtually all of these remains are skulls.
Now let's go back to our graph. It'll tell us exactly who these people are. The Verteba people are represented by the blue box with the red center, and they perfectly fall in line with the Malik Prislavits, blue diamond with a red center. And who are they? Well, they're a big deal in this paper. First, let's confirm this connection with a quick Y chromosome check. Men with the J2a are in green. Men with the J2a are in red. I put the Malik Prislavits and the Verteba men in bold. Every one of them are 2Bs. The one Verteba exception is up top, but that's only because this man wasn't completely typed. We just know he's a J2a. In contrast, 2 individuals that we sampled from Iron Gate site at Lopinski Weir are genetically farmers rather than hunter-gatherers, despite having been buried in local Mesolithic tradition. Strontium isotope data shows that many of the individuals buried after about 6100 BC at Lopinski Weir, including one of the 2 that we sampled, were not originally from the Danube gorges. These observations, combined with one individual from Bedina dated about 6061 to 5841 calibrated BC, that has both farmer and hunter-gatherer ancestry, demonstrates that the Iron Gates region was one where farmer and hunter-gatherer groups interacted both genetically and culturally, and provides a window into the first few generations of interactions between these 2 disparate groups. So, some of the farmers from Anatolia went native. A striking exception to the pattern of limited hunter-gatherer admixture in Balkan Neolithic population is evident in 8 out of 9 individuals from the Malik Prislavits, a site in present-day Bulgaria close to the Danube River. These individuals likely lived in the mid-6th millennia BC and have significantly more hunter-gatherer ancestry than other Balkan Neolithic individuals. We find that a model of 82% Anatolian Neolithic, 15% Western hunter-gatherer, and 4% Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry is a good fit to the data. This hunter-gatherer ancestry with a 4-to-1 Western hunter-gatherer, Eastern hunter-gatherer ratio plausibly represents a contribution from local Balkan hunter-gatherers like those we sampled from the Iron Gates. By the late Mesolithic, hunter-gatherer populations of the Balkans were likely concentrated in sites along the coast and major rivers such as the Danube, which directly connects the Iron Gates with Malik Prislavitz. This suggests a heterogeneous landscape of farmer populations with different proportions of hunter-gatherer ancestry during the early Neolithic, and that farmer groups with the most hunter-gatherer ancestry, like those of Malik Prislavitz and possibly Lipinski Vir, were those that lived close to the highest density of hunter-gatherers, confirming again that these are wild men.
Again, this is coming up. Hang tight. First, real quick, let's go back to that enantiodromia, that circumambulation, because this is at the Verteba Cave. Let's go back to Jung.
During those years between 1918 and 1920, I began to understand that the goal of psychic development is the self. There is no linear evolution. There is only a circumambulation of the self. Uniform development exists at most only at the beginning. Later, everything points toward the center. This insight gave me stability, and gradually my inner peace returned. I knew that in finding the mandala as an expression of the self, I had obtained what was for me the ultimate. Perhaps someone else knows more, but not I. And there's your circumambulation on the pottery. This confirmed to me that I am dealing with matters of the unconscious. This pottery is typical for the period and the area. And what can I say? We are a race of great depth. This kind of motif shows up on Minoan Crete, too. We are, in fact, a race of priests and psychologists. I've said that on several occasions. I've been drawn to this kind of stuff since I was a little boy. On the left, you see maps from the different periods when this cave was in use. This pottery is from the first period. The larger shaded area is general Tropilian territory. The deeper regions are territories that specifically contributed to this cave. This is pottery from the second period, still spirals. And the third period. You can tell the site is about to be abandoned. Plenty of those famous Neolithic figurines in this cave. Animals on the right, man on top, female on the bottom. Look at those faces. We're bird people. Notice the man on top looks almost womanly around the hips. This is something we carry on for thousands of years afterwards in the Mediterranean. This is a chieftain from central Italy during the Iron Age.
So now let's look at the conscious orientation of our collective dreamers. What were our lives like? Well, some of us lived in vast settlements. They dwarfed the original cities of Mesopotamia. We were used to living in big settlements, but these were sprawling even by our standards. And as big as they were, they still weren't true cities. Life for public probably centered around private households, although there was some public space. So we were in an awkward stage. We weren't ready for the next stage, and yet we were still losing touch with our deeper psyche. We were a great tree floating above its own roots. So, these people whose remains we find in the Verteba Cave perfectly suited our needs. They were wild, like we used to be wild. We probably thought they were brave and noble, like the Romans thought of the Celts, or like we used to think about the American Indians, till everybody got pissed at us and told us how evil we were for celebrating their manly virtue. They were the perfect targets for our projection, and so we put a community of them in Verteba Cave, their skulls standing pars pro toto. And so now you have been rewarded for your patience, and you see how the weirdness of the Neolithic Balkans and the skulls were brought together. I also think there were two separate communities that needed to be knitted together. Now, people who love the Aryan invasion theory love to point out that the Proto-Indo-European language shows that we were pastoralists. That means that we were mostly herders, and we seasonally relied on farming. But the language also shows that we lived in settlements at least the size of villages, which means we were settled farmers too. Now, some of these settlements were much bigger than your traditional village, but since we stopped living that way after our Balkan interlude, it shouldn't be a surprise that a lot of the terminology and the titles from those big settlements disappeared. Those of us who went east, intermarried with the locals, and invaded India, eventually abandoned settlements completely that became permanent pastoralists. Those of us who went down to the Mediterranean would eventually build proper cities, but that would be much later. And until then, we were probably strung along trade routes. And we built some good settlements here and there that show up, some very important ones. But as I said, in about 2200 BC, we had our ecological collapse. I talked about that when I talked about the Iranians. It was vast, and it might have been what forced our cousins on the steppes of Russia to become permanent pastoralists. Now, these two communities probably lived symbiotically. They coveted vastly different types of territory, so there wouldn't have been much to fight over. On the contrary, we could have exploited a lot more territory together than we ever would have been able to separately. We would later reestablish this social communion, millennia later, in Iran and central Italy. In the former, farmers would be joined by pastoralists coming in from the steppes of Russia. And in the latter, mountain pastoralists would be joined by city folks coming in from the Mediterranean. Do you see how everything just falls into place when you accept that we are the original Aryans? So now let's amplify our collective dream. I have 4 symbol dictionaries. The one that was most useful here by far was the Penguin Dictionary of Symbols. Let's look at their entry on the skulls.
The secret initiatory society, the core, set 4 earthen-well jars on their altars. These jars are filled with heavenly water collected from the first and last of the annual rains and stand for these 4 cardinal points. That's the skull, the base of the sternum, the navel, and the sexual organs. The central jar, standing in for the skull, contains 4 thunderstones, celestial fire in material shape, expressions of God's spirit and intellect in the human brain, his microcosmic avatar in the shape of the cosmic egg, and life like it, the womb of knowledge. In many Asian and European legends, the human skull is regarded on a par with the vault of heaven. Thus, in the Icelandic Grimnismal, the skull of the giant Ymir becomes the vault of heaven after his death, and similarly, in the Rig Veda, the vault of heaven was fashioned from the skull of the first man. Now, the jar stands for the skull, which has thunderstones, and thunder comes from heaven. Ymir's skull becomes the vault of heaven, as does the skull of the first man. And the Rig Veda might be in Asia, but it's European. So we have 3 skull associations with the vault of heaven. 2 of them are primitive, wild, exactly like our men in the Verteba Cave. I've been studying Indo-European poetics as well as the evolution of the language, and of course we all know how the evolution of any species works. So I know that when 3 separate and widespread Indo-European cultures share a motif like that, there's an excellent chance you're looking at something that came right out of Proto-Indo-European. Obviously, the fact that this also points right back to Anatolians living on the steppes of Russia wouldn't surprise me, because Anatolians on the steppes of Russia were the original Indo-Europeans. So they were not only integrating their personalities during trying times, they were also integrating a sophisticated cosmology. Gilbert Durand, in fact, establishes a parallel between the valorization of verticality on the level of the social macrocosm, archetypes of monarchy. Monarchy is a logical next step in our social evolution. And of the natural macrocosm, sacralization of mountains and of sky, and the human macrocosm. This also offers an excellent explanation for skull worship in all its countless shapes, from ancestral skulls to skulls taken as trophies, as well as for the cosmogenic analogies already mentioned. Notice the trophies. We have a triple integration: the social macrocosm, the natural macrocosm, the human macrocosm. Indo-Europeans love trinities. That's one of the many things that actually marks Christianity as an Indo-European religion. As you now see, this cave will echo down thousands of years of history. You still hear about it today. In Greek initiatory tradition, the cavern represents the world. Servius, in his commentary on Virgil's Eclogues 3:105, writes, "The cavern through which Ceres descended to the underworld in search of her daughter has been called the world." To Plato, this world was a place of ignorance, suffering, and punishment, in which human souls were chained and imprisoned by the gods as if in a cavern. In his Republic, and we know about his Republic and the cave. Now, Plato isn't just a sterile secular philosopher. He's called the divine Plato because his philosophy is firmly based on millennia of Western mystery tradition. The reason why something like that sticks is because it works. This, says Plato, is mankind's condition in this world. The cavern is its image. The shadowy light which flickers upon its walls comes from an invisible sun, but it points the way the soul must follow in search of the good and true. Upward ascent and meditation upon what is above stand for the path the soul must follow to ascend to the seat of the intellect. In Plato, the symbolism of the cave carries not merely cosmic, but ethical and moral significance as well. As I pointed out, the cave is very hard to get into and out of. That's the way this is supposed to work. At the start of many initiation rites, the candidate enters a cavern or pit in which symbolic logic was strictly translated into action. Candidates were placed, bound, in the cave from which they had to escape to reach the light of day. Our spirit is embedded firmly in animal bodies, and as I'll show you, these bodies manifest thought, logos, word. Thus, the fulfillment of the word can't be complete until it includes the redemption of our very flesh. Thus, we Christians insist on physical resurrection. Prior to this, in the religious ceremonies prescribed by Zoroaster, a cave represented the world. Zoroaster was the first to dedicate a natural grotto, watered by springs and thick with foliage and flowers, to Mithras. The cave represents the shape of the world which Mithras had created. Inspired by these beliefs, the Pythagoreans, after them Plato, called the world a cavern or grotto. In fact, according to Empedocles, the powers which guide souls say, "We have come into this grotto covered by a roof." Plotinus remarks of this symbolism that Plato's cave, like Empedocles' grotto, I believe, stands for this world of ours in which progress towards knowledge is deliverance of the soul from its bonds and its escape from the cave. Here we have another marker that we might be looking at a tradition that stretches back to Proto-Indo-European days. Although unless I see a third tradition similar to this from, say, the Celts, it doesn't necessarily have to go back that far. Both linguistic analysis and poetic analysis shows that the Greek and Indic languages, like Iranian and Sanskrit, share common roots. A more mystical view hold that it is Dionysius who is at one and the same time the guardian of the cavern and the one who frees the prisoner by breaking his chains. Since the candidate is another Dionysus, it is he himself who confines himself to prison in the first place and who frees himself in the end. That is to say, as both Plato and Pythagoras regarded the matter, the soul is held prisoner by its own passions and freed by the nous, that is, by the power of the mind. So the god presides over the drama, binds himself, and frees himself. The initiate himself becomes the god, and by doing that, he allows the action of the god to also free him from the world. Now, if you're a Christian and you read your Bible, that sounds familiar. What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? May it never be. How shall we who died into sin still live in it? Or do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into his death? Therefore we have been buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him, in order that our body of sin might be done away with, so that we would no longer be slaves to sin, for he who has died is freed from sin. Now, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with him, knowing that Christ, having been raised from the dead, is never to die again. Death no longer is master over him. For the death that he died to sin once for all. But the life that he lives to God. Even so, consider yourselves to be dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. But there's one innovation that we Christians have made here. Specifically, there's something about the darkness and ignorance we're locked in. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Comprehend also means overcome. The darkness is alive. It has its own agenda. The darkness that traps us isn't a passive thing.
Something that just happens. I see that every day in people's behavior. When somebody is caught up in that little drama going on in their heads, I know better than to meddle. As my therapist said, she said it best, you never argue with a complex. Now, many Romans and many people today object that Christianity is a Semitic religion. After all, the Old Testament is written in a Semitic language and the Israelites were Semites. But as I've been showing you, Christianity is an Indo-European religion, as was the religion of the Israelites before us. And I think that's why Europeans took to it so easily. It was familiar. In fact, I'm going to go one step farther. I don't think Christianity is just a fulfillment of the Old Testament. I think it's a fulfillment of Greek philosophy and religion. In fact, in many respects, I think it's a more authentic version of the original Indo-European religion. I'll go over that in future videos in a lot more detail. But this leads us to the number one thing that most modern Europeans think is crazy about Christianity, its insistence on the physical resurrection. Now, here's what I do not believe. I do not believe we endured the agony of 4 billion years of evolution for nothing. I do not believe we're some wispy little spirit kicking around in a ramshackle physical body. I think it's a lot more complicated than that, or more interesting. And Aristotle agrees. Aristotle shows that the human soul is the human natural form, all of it. It is the physical, firmly embedded in the world, reaching all the way up into the realm of the spirit, where it is likewise firmly embedded. We are a tree with roots at two ends. Which roots were we disconnected from as the trillion? Our spiritual roots. Some people are disconnected from their physical roots. We might call them schizophrenic. So, the divine Plato is often contrasted with the more earthly and physical Aristotle, and we're forced to choose, Plato or Aristotle. How can both be so contrasting and so amazing and so equally true? And yet they are, and Christianity says yes to both. Let's see how this works. Let's see why Christ had to be physically incarnated and why he had to endure the torture of his death. Let's see why we get to enjoy the blessings of his resurrection. Let's see why those trillion had to claw their way out of that cave. Now for the graphics that follow, I'm going to tweak them a little bit. It's going to be based on a theory of consciousness called the Orchestrated Objective Reduction, Orch-OR. You don't need to know anything about it except what I show. If you want to know more, I link a video about it below. The graphic itself comes from the Modeling of Nature by William Wallace. In the beginning was proto-matter. It was without boundary or discipline, but it was pregnant with everything that would come afterwards. But the Orch-OR theory is based on a premise that there's a flip side to this matter, consciousness. Or to put it in biblical and philosophical terms, as the articulated mind and will of God, it is the Logos. It is firmly embedded in everything. Nothing exists that does not exist within the Logos. Or really, the image of the Logos, not the Logos itself. That is its own separate and eternal reality. I'm not going to defend this there, I'm just going to announce it. I'm convinced that this or something like this is very close to the truth. From the Logos emerge the four elementary forces: electromagnetic force, chemical reactions, gravitational force, gravitational interactions, weak force, radioactive emissions, the strong force, nuclear reactions. This is the natural form of all inanimate objects, the soul of those objects, and this soul includes a consciousness. But like the original proto-matter, this consciousness is without discipline and without direction, no up or down or in or out. So it needed to be harnessed, as only life can harness it. And so life happened. I don't think it was an accident. I don't think we were lucky. Embedded within life is the Logos. The Logos has a purpose, and it has a purpose, a teleology. I know you atheists hate the T word, but you really need to listen to those crazy creationists because they're onto something, even if they don't quite know what they're onto. The bottom line is this: the idea that life arose on earth by accident is crazy. When God said, let something happen, he's saying, within the universe there is a will. Let the will have its way. So now, let's look at life directly, starting with plants. Obviously, we'll build on those first four forces. From the very beginning, every life form has to maintain a stable inner environment, temperature, moisture, etc. It does this with homeostatic control. Every life form needs reproductive power to create successor life forms. It needs metabolic control for food and energy conversions. It needs developmental power of cell differential and growth. Homeostatic control and metabolic control are bound together, as are the developmental power and reproductive power. Indeed, there's something of a trade-off between the two. All of this is bound together by the Logos, the conscious aspect of proto-matter, and we've got the natural form of a plant. And we know that plants actually do feel pain and have consciousness. Their version of brain cells are actually in the leading edges of their root fibers. So if you're eating the very tip of a carrot, you're eating its brains. And animals are built on top of this. Already from the fact that I've made proto-matter equivalent with the Logos, this diagram is going to be fuzzier than Aristotle thought it was. Things he ascribed only to animals we know plants had as well, but aside from my one change, I'm sticking with the original graphic. An animal has sensation and perception, as do plants, but compared to what animals have, theirs is a pale reflection. Sensation and perception are yoked with motor powers and emotion, which we can also be sure plants have, but once again, surely at a much lower level. We bump into the world, and this almost instantly results in perception and some kind of motor power. Or maybe, in addition, it's processed through emotion, then motor power, then a response. And we have the logos and the natural form of the animal, the soul of the animal. And now, we're going to build on this. To look at the human. Until now, life is just embedded in the world. It took us billions of years to get here. Only now are we ready to reach into eternity. Only now is eternity ready to pour into the world. And here's the proof. When you have a perception, you form a percept. And the power of intellection meditates on the percept. The creative intellect actively roots out as many percepts as possible. The receptive intellect receives these percepts and meditates on them. And most importantly, it pulls these percepts together and creates a new form out of those percepts. It carries them. Then it gives birth to a concept, conceived by the action of the masculine creative intellect together with the feminine receptive intellect. The process of intellection is fed by and fed into the will, which can drive the emotion. And of course, all this feeds into the logos and the earlier forms we built on, and we have the natural form of the human. Now, we need to take a closer look at this concept building. And this is where the human reaches into the eternal. This is where Aristotle builds up to Plato, both and the Christian way. We have things outside the mind and things inside the mind. Things outside the mind are the foundation of percepts. This yellow sulfur, this lead ball. Within the mind, we have the matters eternal. Now and only now are we outside the mundane world. And while once we could say this was only happening with humans, we now know that's probably not true. But once again, nobody comes close to us in the extent of our movement into eternity. In the mind, we have real concepts. Plato's ideal of sulfur, or yellow, or element. Plato's ideal of lead, or heavy, or cold. We also have eternal mathematical ideals and metaphysical ideals. Sphere, or five. Being, substance, existence. Logical concepts. Subject and predicate. All, or some. Genus, species. P and Q. If P, then Q, or P, therefore Q. We see all of these eternal things because we have eternal eyes, and it took us billions of years to grow them. This single fact might be something Hare Krishnas and Gnostics and Muslims might be willing to blow off. We are not, and neither is God. Let's keep pushing. Let's start with 5 yellow crystals of sulfur. We're going to look at how the intellect works on these, and the will, and of course they wash back and forth between each other. We have an act of conceptualizing with the 5 crystals of sulfur. But to do that, you need the eternal concepts. Sulfur, crystal, yellow, 5. In the will, you have the act of intending. I intend to examine the sulfur. The formal intention is within the intellect. The objective intention, the object of the intention, is the 5 crystals of sulfur. This is what is conceptualized. The will also has a formal intention. To examine the sulfur is the objective intention. It is what is intended. Back and forth between heaven and earth we go. Each instant, every instant. It's what we were made to do. It's what we spent 4 billion years fighting to do. You're not being spiritual by blowing this off. Now, one technique that Carl Jung developed is called active imagination. It works something like this. An image will pop up in your head, and you can't really stop thinking about it. You keep going back to it. You let that image develop under its own steam. You don't meddle. It might end up developing into a full-fledged personal mythology. The most famous exemplar of that is Carl Jung's Red Book. And you might be called to act upon that image, as Carl Jung did when he created the Red Book. Remember, the physical is seamlessly part of the human soul. Working with dreams, working with projections, active imagination. These are all ways of integrating contents of the unconscious. Now, the following is an image that imposed itself on Jung when he was still a schoolboy in Basel, Switzerland. The town had a fortified castle with a tall keep. And of course, Jung, like all of us, projected on that castle and its keep. Now, here's something about projection. It's not a bad thing. Psychologically speaking, projection helps you see the back of your own head. It just becomes a problem when you keep confusing your projections for the real world. Now, as you will see, this castle and its keep could have developed into a full series of young adult fiction books, like the Chronicles of Narnia. C.G. Jung and C.S. Lewis were around at the same time.
The nerve center and raison d'etre of this whole arrangement was the secret of the keep, which I alone knew. The thought had come to me like a shock, for inside the tower, extending from the battlements to the vaulted cellar, was a copper column or heavy wire cable as thick as a man's arm, which ramified at the top into the finest branches, like the crown of a tree, or, better still, like a taproot, with all its tiny rootlets turned upside down and reaching into the air. From the air they drew a certain inconceivable something which was conducted down the copper column into the cellar. Here I had an equally inconceivable apparatus, a kind of laboratory, in which I made gold out of the mysterious substance which the copper roots drew from the air. This was really an arcanum, of whose nature I neither had nor wished to form any conception, nor did my imagination concern itself with the nature of the transformation process. Tactfully, and with a certain nervousness, it skirted around what actually went on in this laboratory. There was a kind of inner prohibition. One was not supposed to look into it too closely, nor ask what kind of substance was extracted from the air. As Goethe says of the mothers, even to speak of them dismays the bold.
So you have this mysterious substance with which you can make gold, and a mysterious process by which you can do it. None of this would work without the castle and its keep and the copper column as thick as a man's arm to bring in the substance. So now you see why this cave in the western Ukraine was so important. I don't think the archaeologists who investigated this cave really understand themselves. So now we're going to move on to another parallel between what was going on way up here and thousands of years later down on Minoan Crete, and northern Syria, and Jerusalem.
For this, we take a close look at the Varna Necropolis, from which samples were taken from 4 people. A 5th is an outlier set aside by this paper. Probably the most spectacular man here was the one labeled ANI 152. And out of more than 260 men they have in this study, I see to my annoyance that he's only one of 8 who have not been solidly typed. 3% untyped, 97% typed. The only thing CT tells me is this man is not an African. Maybe.
I would be okay if this man were not a J2A. I've said several times I'm willing to walk away from everything I've said in all of my videos if the facts told me I needed to. For example, I accepted for decades the proven historical fact that my ancestors were goddess-worshipping farmers who got beat up by virile Aryans. That is until I took a good look at the case and saw how shallow and ridiculous it was. But just as I am deprived of promising locations where I'm sure I will find J2A men, and the locations I do have access to have a shocking lack of male representation, here I am deprived of a promising vocation in which I'm sure I will find J2A men, because I'm pretty sure this man is a priest. In fact, I know who he's a priest of, and let me prove it.
The midline dating for this man is 4545 BC. All of these samples are from the mid-5th millennia BC. These 2 figurines are from the nearby Hamangia culture. This culture was on its last legs at the time. The archaeology indicates that it was mostly a transit region. People tended to pass through there on the way somewhere else. The physical features that I find most striking are the flat faces and the prominent noses. They concentrate almost exclusively on faces. Other than that, these figures have almost no heads. You see that with this Vinča figurine as well. I was studying these figurines on the Cyclades Islands first. And when I saw those Balkan examples, I was automatically struck by the significant parallels. So the people who traveled through the Cyclades, who I think eventually spearheaded Minoan civilization on Crete, have another obvious parallel with those Balkan farmers. They're doing figurines long after they stopped doing them in the Balkans. I think it's because most of us migrated out of the Balkans.
But I never made a big deal out of it with my videos. In fact, I don't think I've ever mentioned it in my videos. But now I'm looking up in the Balkans and in the western steppes of Russia, And at the Varna Necropolis, I found a huge parallel. The gentleman, labeled ANI 152, is a big deal. He is the very first priest of Apollo we have ever laid our eyes on.
At least he is, if this is the gentleman they're talking about. In the center, you see a sun disk, just like the Festus disk. And there are other objects that look like buttons. I would say they're stars. Around his head, we see a nimbus, a halo. He's holding a war adze, and he's wearing a penis sheath, which reminds me of the very prominent phallus sheath worn by the so-called young god on Minoan Crete, whom I have determined to be the sun god. In the Rig Veda, he is called Surya. On Crete, they call him Sarya, and it's on Minoan Crete that he eventually became known as Apollo. Here we see him holding a staff. I think it's the axis mundi. Minoan ancestors in the Balkans probably invented the wheel. The axis mundi, the axis of the world, was the model on which the wheel and axle were based. ANI 152 probably died before the wheel was invented, so at this stage he's holding a weapon. But it's important that he's holding something. The sun god is not known to do that in the Rig Veda like he is on Minoan Crete. Now, Minoan ancestors did not invent the chariot. That was done by their cousins who'd moved to the Ural Mountains in Russia. Thus, on Minoan Crete, he does not have one. It was the Greeks who made that iconographic innovation. Here's the Hittite ritual that I used to prove the Festus disk is authentic. Notice that just like on Minoan Crete, the manhood of the sun god is important for the ritual, and we now know it had been for thousands of years by this time.
Two things. First, this aspect of the sun god was lost to the later Greeks and to the Hindus. This confirms my contention that Christianity is in many respects a conservative Indo-European tradition. Secondly, I did not know the Hittites had a sun god. I thought they had a sun goddess, and they got her from the Hatti, a people whom they had conquered. So apparently they had two sun deities, a sun god from their Indo-European tradition and a sun goddess from the Hatti. Now, as I've said in several of my videos, King Solomon's temple is a Hittite temple, and the book of Deuteronomy, which is the treaty between God and the Israelites, is a Hittite treaty with Assyrian verbiage. These people had to have had a major impact on the Bible. There's no way they didn't, and not just on the Old Testament. I see that going all the way into the New Testament era as well. I found a Hittite parallel to one of Jesus' sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. I was shocked. Let me tell you, it takes all I can to keep my mouth shut about a lot of this, but this video is already a lot longer than I planned on it being. Let me prove my point.
But not everyone has heeded the good news, for Isaiah says, "Lord, who has believed what was heard from us?" Thus faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes from the word of Christ. But I ask, did they not hear? Certainly they did. He's talking about his fellow Jews. For their voice has gone forth to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. So Paul is paraphrasing Psalm 19. For the leader, a psalm of David. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament proclaims the works of his hands. Day unto day pours forth speech. Night unto night whispers knowledge. There is no speech, no words. Their voice is not heard. A report goes forth through all the earth, their messages, to the ends of the world. So St. Paul is saying the stars told the Jews about Jesus. So what is he talking about? Well, the Star of Bethlehem, of course. That's why the story of the stars in the Gospel of Matthew is considered the Jewish Gospel. Let's keep reading. He has pitched in them a tent for the sun. It comes forth like a bridegroom from his canopy, and like a hero joyfully runs its course. From one end of the heavens it comes forth. Its course runs through to the other. Nothing escapes its heat. So we have two of our elements here in a psalm of King David. The sun, who is a bridegroom. And how does a bridegroom bring joy to a bridal chamber? There is only one way. I don't need to draw a map for you. And other examples of iconography on Minoan Crete makes it perfectly clear that the sun god was, in fact, a bridegroom. But this hero part, very strange. The literal Hebrew is strong man, but he's a runner, like he's running a race. This should sound very Greek to you, which is why some translate this phrase as champion or athlete, which makes it sound even more Greek. And now that I think about it, I think I figured out why Greek athletes always ran naked. The priest of Apollo probably did too. And I got news for you. A lot of things you think are Greek, they got from us. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it turns out we had an earlier version of the Olympic Games. Kings David and Solomon, chronological, historical, and archaeological evidence. The parallels that I'm showing in this video, and I'm not done yet, make the case even stronger that King David and Solomon actually existed. Remember, Psalm 19 is considered a Psalm of David. For example, Taita was a king of Palestine, a Syrian land including Hamath and Aleppo. Of course, we talked about that. And according to the Bible, as king of Hamath, he congratulated King David when the latter defeated Hadadezer, about 1042 BC, a king of Aram Zobah. The name of Taita is derived from the Hurrian word taheta, of man, abbreviated as tahe, which explains the T vocalization in Hebrew, because Taita is named either Toi, Tu, or Thoa in the Septuagint in the Bible. Now, who was Jesus? The son of David, and the son of man. Jesus told us in the Gospel of John that he had another flock. He's talking about us. It's amazing how we fit right into this picture, isn't it? These were the people who would eventually be conquered by the Assyrian Empire. Regarding the dating of Taita's reign, a beam of Aleppo temple attributed to Taita has been dated to 1045 plus or minus 45 years by carbon-14 dating. Beside King Taita, the opposite figure, appears the hieroglyphic Luwian inscription, I, King Taita, the hero, king of the land of Palestine, written Philistine in Egypt. Okay, the hero. Notice he's not wearing any shoes. Notice he's not wearing a lot of clothes. Notice the long hair. This is the king standing in as a sun god, just as on Minoan Crete and up in Varna in Bulgaria, the priest stood in as a sun god. Put it all together and it makes one thing very clear. King David got Psalm 19 from the Philistines living in northern Syria, my people. So the sun is a runner. Now, I've talked about a runner before, but until I did this video, I had no idea who that runner was. Now I know. They were talking about the sun. This is the paper that convinced me the Indo-European language is from the steppes of Russia, the Indo-European homeland from linguistic and archaeological perspectives. I actually use this paper to show that my Anatolian ancestors in the Balkans almost certainly invented the wheel. Axles cannot exist apart from wheeled vehicles, so a word meaning axle in late Proto-Indo-European is evident that wheeled vehicles existed during the period when late Proto-Indo-European was spoken. Actually, that's not true. We have the axis mundi, the connection between heaven and earth. The wheeled vehicle could easily have come from our theology. So there are two words for wheel in the Indo-European language. One became the word wheel in English. The other became the English word rotor. The word rotor is the Latin word, very gratifying. I think their ancestors were the Balkan Anatolians who invented the wheel. Rotos is the agent noun meaning runner. And if you look at the Vinča script, you see runners, and you see the sun. And so put it all together. The sun is the runner. And now I know, because the Bible told me. And as we are to put on Christ and become Christ, we are to become runners. Do you not know that the runners in the stadium all run in the race, but only one wins the prize? Run so as to win. Every athlete exercises discipline in every way. They do it to win a perishable crown, but we an imperishable one. Thus I do not run aimlessly. I do not fight as if I were shadowboxing. No, I drive my body and train it, for fear that, after having preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. And of course, this supports my contention that the young god in Minoan iconography is the sun god, for it is precisely this runner who's associated with the axle. He's the wheel. And there's something else that's striking about this imagery of the sun god. His staff connects heaven and earth, just like the copper column in Carl Jung's biography. We are made in the image of the sun god. That shouldn't surprise anybody who's read the creation story in the book of Genesis. Now there's one more Psalm of David that I'm going to look at that I think is inspired by Philistine poets. Psalm 48. Great is the Lord and highly praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, fairest of heights, the joy of all the earth, Mount Zion, the heights of Zaphon, the city of the great king. God is in its citadel, renowned as a stronghold. See, the kings assembled, together they advanced. When they looked, they were astounded. Terrified, they were put to flight. Trembling seized them there, anguish like a woman's labor, as when the east wind wrecks the ships of Tarshish. Now, let's look at the second verse. Fairest of heights, the joy of all the earth, Mount Zion, the heights of Zaphon, the city of the great king. Zaphon is the sacred mountain of the Philistines in northern Syria. It's their version of Mount Olympus. And this looks like a straightforward passage, but it's really not. Nobody knows how to translate this verse. Mount Zion is the heights of Zaphon here, but there are radically different translations of this passage. The heights of Zaphon is Mount Zion. Mount Zion, the holy mount. Mount Zaphon is completely ignored. Mount Zion in the far north. A lot of scholars assume Zaphon is a metonym. That means Zaphon is just a Hebrew way of saying the north. The problem is Mount Zion isn't in the far north. In fact, it's not even in the north of Jerusalem. It's the southernmost hill. King James Bible. Mount Zion is on the sides of the north? On the sides? What does that even mean? And once again, Mount Zion is on the south. Mount Zion towards the north, same problem. Mount Zion resembles the peaks of Zaphon. Well, at least that makes sense. Mount Zion is in the north slopes. On the northern ridge? What ridge? What's going on here? Now let's go to a literal translation. Beautiful, for situation, the joy, all, earth, is Mount, Zion, on the sides of the north. They actually jumped the gun here and just assumed Zaphon is a metonym. That's begging the question. The literal reading is, Zion is on the sides of Zaphon, the city, king of the great. Now let's look at the Yarkate on the sides. The King James, with the exception of Ezekiel 38:6, consistently translates this phrase as something to do with the sides.
So I've been keeping up with my archaeology. Is there something on the side of Zaphon that can help us out here? Well, as a matter of fact, there is.
There's a peak sanctuary, and there were also peak sanctuaries on Minoan Crete. Quelle coincidence. And as I showed you in my video, the Festus disc is authentic, Minoan, and Italic. These peak sanctuaries were called Zoanitino. And I figured that out because in the Hittite Empire, they had the Zahanetina. So it's not hard to guess that on Mount Zaphon, the peak sanctuary was probably called something like Zionetina. Zion is the peak sanctuary on Mount Zaphon, and that's why we never hear about a Zion until the reign of King David, because that's when the Israelites came in contact with the Philistines in northern Syria. But wait, there is more. In the Balkans, we had ritual house burning. Remember that? I told you it was coming back around. And we have at least one documented case of house burning on Minoan Crete. Later, that ritual would be manifested as giant bonfires at the peak sanctuaries. In the ritual for the sun god in the Hittite Empire, we've got a fire altar. And on Mount Zaphon, we have a big mountain of ash, about 180 feet wide and 26 feet high, 55 by 8 meters. And down in Egypt, we have a fire god, worshipped on an island in the Nile River called Elephantine, at a Jewish temple.
Not a synagogue, a full-fledged bona fide temple. This is about 400 BC, and they were in constant contact with the temple in Jerusalem, and they were on good terms with it. Now, the source that I got this from assumes that the Jews here are polytheists. They are not. They are monotheists, but not monotheists like Muslims or modern-day Jews. They are monotheists exactly like us modern-day Christians. God is a Godhead. In our case, is a Trinity. We Christians are right about God's name in the Old Testament. Elohim does not mean God. It means gods. If he were just God, it would be El. The fire god is just another manifestation of Yahweh. You read that in the book of Ezekiel. I don't have time to go into that there, so I'm just going to keep my mouth shut about it. So this part of the psalm was not originally about Mount Zion in Jerusalem. It was about the Zionetina on the side of Mount Zaphon. Verse 8 confirms this.
Mount Zion doesn't have anything to do with ships from Tarshish.
But Mount Zaphon does. It's a giant mountain, it sits right on the coast, and it's known to split storms in two. The Hurrian storm god Teshub defeats the sea from Mount Zaphon. Captains on ships from Tarshish would know about Zaphon. So let's pull it all together. We have a sun god who's associated with fire. He is, as I've shown you, the intermediary between heaven and earth. On Minoan Crete and in northern Syria, he looks like Jesus. And in northern Syria, at least one of their kings, standing in as a sun god, also bears one of Jesus' titles. I have a lot more where that came from, believe me, but In India, in the Rig Veda, the only god mentioned more frequently than the fire god is the king of the gods himself, the storm god Indra. That's where India comes from. Okay. Soma is a distant third. The Rig Veda is the oldest scripture in India. Okay. Together, Indra and Agni, and the fire god is named Agni, are mentioned almost as often as all of the other gods combined. It's pretty close. But it gets better. Indra is Agni, and Agni is Indra. They are two manifestations of the same God, just like the Lord Jesus Christ is the Father in heaven. Just like that fire god is also Yahweh at that Jewish temple on the Elephantine Island. But it gets better. Remember, the sun god is the intermediary between heaven and earth, just like Jesus, because this is a prophecy of Jesus. In the Vedas, Agni is also the intermediary between heaven and earth. In heaven, he's the sun. In the sky, he's thunder, the thunder god, Indra. And on earth, he's fire. So, at our Zoal Nitino on Minoan Crete, we have giant bonfires lit at the temple of the sun god, heaven and earth. Archaeologists are baffled at all of the fires that we would set on the Balkan Peninsula and in the western steppes of Russia. I am baffled that they are baffled. We are where we need to be, when we need to be, and acting just like the original Aryans. We are in perfect accord with what we know about early and Aryan religion, and we are in perfect accord with the early Proto-Indo-European language as reconstructed by linguists. In that language, fire was important. There were two words for it, an active form and a passive form. The English word fire is the passive form. This is the Greek word pyre. The English word igneous is the active form, like Agni, the fire god. But it gets better. Every language has a singular and plural form, but Proto-Indo-European had a dual. So the duo, the double, the twin, these were also important for Indo-Europeans. And some of our most striking figurines are of twinned individuals. The one on the left from the Lessing archive is Vinča. The one on the right from Getty Images is from Anatolia itself. This carries on into Sardinia, which I think was the center of gravity for the sea people. Later with the Romans, Castor and Pollux were important. One twin was human, the other divine. Pay attention, they're coming back. This explains the other odd group of figurine warriors on Sardinia. They're called bronzetti because they're made of bronze. 2 sets of eyes, 2 sets of arms. Their warriors were called upon to unite their human and their divine halves. Twinning also lurks in Christianity. We're called upon to become twins of Christ. But this is even more apparent in the Gospel of Thomas, a very odd little piece that I think represents a hitherto unknown Indo-European tradition that I have no doubt Jesus respected. It opens with a bang. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. Thomas is Aramaic for twin. Didymos is Greek for twin. So Didymos Thomas is twin. We are literally twinning twins here. He's one of Jesus' apostles, and some think he's Jesus' twin. And sure enough, the idea of a divine twin makes appearance in the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus saw infants being suckled. He said to his disciples, "These infants being suckled are like those who enter the kingdom." They said to him, "Shall we then as children enter the kingdom?" Jesus said to them, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and the female one and the same, so that the male not be male, nor the female female, and when you fashion eyes in the place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, and a likeness in place of a likeness, then you will enter the kingdom." So here Jesus goes into detail. But whose eye is this? Whose hand? I think it's his, Jesus's. He will become our higher twin. We read that later. Jesus said, "He who will drink from my mouth will become like me. I myself shall become he, and the things that are hidden will be revealed to him." But it gets better, because I found an almost exact parallel with this passage in a Hittite ritual. We're mapping our body to a divine twin, Christ. We move from eyes to hand to foot. The same applies to several Hittite rituals involving the successive enumeration and apposition of the body parts of a newborn child to those of a scapegoat who is then killed. Scapegoat, that's in the Bible. Eyes are fitted to eyes, handan, or those of an ailing celebrant.
Let us take the illness of his arse. So, for example, in Gene Beckman's birth ritual, Text C, revision 11 through 16, a scapegoat is held to the newborn, and eyes are fitted, hunden to eyes, and so on, over a total of 13 body parts to foot. Kub 4353, I1 prime through 18 prime, enumerates no less than 21 body parts, beginning with head corresponds, daki, to head, finishing with feet, and as an afterthought, hands. The middle Hittite ritual of Tunawiya, CHT 760I.1, edited by Hutter in 1988, and its parallel, CHT 760I.2, edited by Beckman in 1990, each contains two lists, beginning head is fitted, handan to head, and head will lift sickness of head, and continue respectively to foot and toenail. This is one of many examples of Indo-European medical charms. There are many body part parallels like this, but the Hittites are the only Indo-Europeans who mapped body parts to body parts like this. Logon 22 in the Gospel of Thomas is obviously part of a long forgotten Indo-European tradition still alive among the Jews, and I think the Holy Spirit preserved this tradition so Jesus could remind the world of the part we played in the world's salvation. So now we know the Hittites are Indo-Europeans. Things are about to get even more interesting. This is Hittite. It's from the modern city of Kotepe in Turkey, which is where the Hittites are from originally. A very gratifying discovery for me. Obviously, doubly obvious since it instantly reminds me of these so-called frying pans that you find on the Cyclades Islands, which are roughly contemporaneous with their Hittite sample. And once again, I'm convinced that these are the people who eventually became the Minoans, and then the Romans after that. You can see two knobs. These particular knobs don't have heads, but two heads were there. You just can't see them right now. Notice you're looking at the bottom of an actual pan. You can see the sides of the pan behind them. Look at the sun and the geometric figures. These are symbols of the divine world, the sun god himself. More sun patterns. The enantiodromia and circumambulation, the rotation about the center. This is the nous which descends from above, the divine mind. A canoe in a sea of stars. Right now there are no rowers, not yet. A tuna leaps above the prow. The huge animal beckons, inviting you to the great game, happy hunting grounds on celestial waters. What were these so-called frying pans used for? Many think these were used as mirrors, and I agree. Studies of different liquids in pans made of the same material has shown that olive oil works best. And here we are in the Mediterranean. So let's see how this works. You set this pan down on a table and you put in your olive oil. On one side you have your twin prongs and the land of the gods, the big world calling to you. You bend over and you look in, and you see you looking back at you. And there are your two heads, yours and yours. We groan for heaven on earth, but with God's will, you are already in heaven. All you have to do is reach up and take the hand that's reaching down to you from heaven. Trust the Lord. He is exactly who you think he is. And you are a big deal. He would not come down and suffer torture and death at the hands of the enemy if he didn't believe that. And the enemy wouldn't be so stupid as to torture and murder the Son of God if he didn't agree. These frying pans are a down payment, a foretaste of glory divine. For we know partially, and we prophesy partially. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I used to talk as a child, think as a child, reason as a child. When I became a man, I put aside childish things. Presently, we see indistinctly, as in a mirror. Then, face to face. At present, I know partially. Then, I shall know fully, as I shall be fully known. So, faith, hope, love. These three. But the greatest of these is love. St. Paul of Tarsus, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. If you have not read this passage, drop everything you're doing and read it right now. It is the greatest thing anyone has ever written anywhere in any scripture in the history of the world. You'll want to frame it and put it on your wall. Take your snout out of the trough.
There's a big world calling you. Look up. Look up. One final thing. Brother Paul was executed by the Romans. He was a Roman citizen, so they couldn't crucify him, so they beheaded him. He got on a ship that took him from Sicily to Rome. That was the last ship he would ever set foot on. Who was that ship dedicated to? Do you know?
Paul arrives at Rome. We set sail on an Alexandrian ship, which had the twin brothers for its figurehead.
We always thought giving that ship a name was a nice little touch of reality, or verisimilitude if you think we made all this up. But now we know the Holy Spirit was telling Brother Paul, who had looked into the mirror darkly, that he was about to win his race. Just as God had promised my ancestors thousands of years ago, if we stuck with him. It does not surprise me that the civilization we built, Western civilization, is a twin civilization. Rome and Greece, Washington, and Moscow. Once upon a time, this civilization was presided over by a triumphant Jesus Christ. And I got news for you. It's going to happen again. Certainly when he comes back. Probably before. Lord Jesus, our hero.